Journeys of Return and Redemption, Zechariah Overview. The studio microphones catch the gentle rustle of closing notebooks as the production lights soften. Alex Rivera leans forward, checking his audio levels before speaking into the microphone with a warm, steady resonance. Welcome back to Journeys of Return and Redemption. We have traveled a long, gritty road over these past episodes, tracking the dusty footprints of a weary remnant. We watched them return from Babylon in the records of Ezra and Nehemiah, clearing charred rubble with a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other. Just last week, we concluded our study of Haggai, where the community was shaken out of their spiritual apathy and forced to confront the holes in their pockets. Today, we stand at the threshold of the grand finale of our multi-book project. We are pulling back the curtain on the book of Zechariah, a panoramic masterpiece that takes the literal stone foundations laid by Haggai and completely explodes them into cosmic apocalyptic realities. Next week, we begin our micro-focused verse-by-verse journey through chapter 1, but today, we need the macro view. We need to look at the massive hidden architecture of this entire prophecy to understand where this return is ultimately leading. Dr. Naomi taps her pen against the edge of a parallel layout chart, her eyes bright with historical anticipation. The transition from Haggai to Zechariah is a masterclass in narrative scale, Alex. Haggai was a pragmatist. He was on the ground auditing timber contracts, empty grain heaps, and the exact day of the calendar month when the stones were laid. But Zechariah opens his mouth just 2 months later, in 520 BC, and suddenly the physical landscape of Jerusalem dissolves into a canvas of night visions, multicolored horses hidden in myrtle groves, flying scrolls, and mountains made of solid bronze. He isn't just telling them to finish the building. He is showing them the cosmic blueprint behind why the building matters. Rabbi Jonah nods, adjusting his glasses as he traces a finger down an unchaptered scroll layout. It is a profound reclamation of identity, Naomi. The text is showing a community that has spent 70 years drowning in Babylonian culture, that God is executing a severe, structural decontamination protocol. Look at the vision of the woman inside the ephah basket in chapter 5. The text identifies her as Risha, the raw embodiment of corporate, institutional wickedness and deceptive commerce. Zechariah sees an angel slam a heavy lead weight down over the container, trapping the pollution, and then 2 women with wings like storks launch into the sky, carrying the basket away. And where do they take it? The text is hyper-precise. They take it to the plain of Shinar to build a permanent temple for it. That geographical marker immediately reactivates the ancient blueprint of Genesis chapter 11. Shinar is Babylon. It is the exact site of the Tower of Babel, where human hubris first attempted to build an engine of security and dominance independent of the vertical authority of God. Zechariah is demonstrating that for Jerusalem to function as a spatial center of holiness, the internal engine of Babylonian deception must be physically torn out by its roots and exported back to its native point of origin. Purity isn't just about sweeping the temple floors. It's a systemic, geographical relocation of sin. Thomas leans back in his heavy oak chair, crossing his arms as his analytical engineering mind processes the spatial imagery. That type of total containment makes sense to me from a purely operational standpoint, Jonah. If you don't isolate the systemic compromise at the center of an infrastructure, the whole project eventually fails under the weight of its own rot. But what really hits me as a father is the contrast between that intense containment and the complete vulnerability we see in chapter 8. Zechariah describes a future Jerusalem where old men and old women are resting on their staffs along the streets, and the open public plazas are filled with boys and girls playing. If you look at that through a standard first-century military lens, or even through the lens of Ezekiel chapter 38, it looks like a logistical nightmare. Ezekiel chapter 38 explicitly maps out a landscape of unwalled villages, dwelling without bars or gates, as a massive strategic liability. It is a wide-open invitation for a hostile coalition to sweep in and decimate a defenseless populace. In human warfare, letting your most vulnerable assets, your children and your elderly, fill unwalled plazas is catastrophic exposure. But Zechariah shatters that entire defensive metric. He reveals that the city doesn't need stone battlements or high walls because Yahweh has legally decreed, "I will be a wall of fire all around her." True safety isn't found in building bigger fortresses to hide behind. It's found when the divine presence operationalizes so completely that physical liability is utterly bypassed. It's a blueprint for a home, a community, where fear is dismantled from the inside out. Sophia smiles, her voice carrying a quiet emotional weight that grounds the technical layout. It really is a beautiful portrait of restoration, Thomas. It shows a God who cares about the daily, ordinary rhythm of human life. Children playing safely in the streets after generations of trauma, displacement, and defensive warfare. And that theme of breaking through physical barriers is what makes the final chapters so breathtaking. In chapter 14, the text describes the feet of the Lord standing upon the Mount of Olives, triggering a massive, localized cataclysm that splits the limestone ridge cleanly in half, creating a massive valley running directly from east to west. To understand the gravity of that geographical rupture, you have to realize that the Mount of Olives forms an absolute physical blockade directly to the east of Jerusalem, completely cutting the city off from a straight descent to the Dead Sea Basin. By tearing that mountain down the center, the prophecy creates the exact spatial pathway required for the living waters of Ezekiel chapter 47 to surge out from beneath the temple threshold. Zechariah's cataclysm provides the physical infrastructure for Ezekiel's cosmic river, ripping open the ancient blockades of the earth to allow the life-giving, healing, stream-free, unhindered passage down into the deepest, most stagnant desolations of creation. Father Elias leans forward, his hands resting flat on the table as he bridges the prophetic architecture directly into the gospel narratives. And that, Sophia, is precisely why the synoptic writers treat the final chapters of Zechariah as their primary operational script for the Passion Week. They didn't just grab random verses out of context to use as proof texts. They mapped the entire narrative flow of the cross against Zechariah's specific apocalyptic coordinates. When Jesus rides into the city on Palm Sunday lowly and upon a donkey's colt, Matthew and John explicitly invoke Zechariah chapter 9 verse 9 to declare that this king has arrived to dismantle the militaristic cavalry options of Rome. When Judas betrays the true shepherd, Matthew tracks the exact valuation ledger of 30 pieces of silver being cast into the house of the Lord for the potter from chapter 11. When the Roman spear pierces his side on Good Friday, John points directly to chapter 12, where the community looks upon the one they have pierced and breaks into corporate mourning. Even in Gethsemane, when Jesus warns the disciples that they will all scatter in the dark, he quotes Zechariah chapter 13 verse 7, "Strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered." The gospel writers are showing us that the cross was not a chaotic tactical failure. It was the deliberate execution of Zechariah's refinement process. The shepherd had to be struck. The mountain of human rebellion had to be shattered, so that the living waters of the new covenant could finally break free to cleanse the world. Alex Rivera monitors the final segment markers on his display, leaning closer to his microphone as he prepares to close the session. The depth of this overview leaves us with a profound realization as we stand ready to launch into chapter 1 next week. In the historical records of Ezra and Nehemiah, we saw human hands building physical structures to keep the hostile world out. But as we step into Zechariah, we are forced to see a larger, more radical kingdom. It is a kingdom that doesn't hide behind stone walls, but expands as an unwalled village under a canopy of fire. It is a reality where our internal deceptions are packed away to Shinar, where the heavy blockades that cut us off from life are seismically split open, and where the final compliance metric is so absolute that even the most ordinary cooking pots and the bells on the horses are marked with the highest seal of sanctuary holiness. The return from exile is completed not when the stone temple is built, but when the entire cosmos becomes the dwelling place of the king. As Alex prepares to close the podcast, he leans forward and says, "I'm Alex Rivera, and this has been Journeys of Return and Redemption."